Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Kory, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello humans, it's your host Kory, and today we're going to talk about abuse narratives. And what do I mean by that? Abuse narratives are when we write a story about the things that have happened to us. Often these stories paint ourselves as the bad guy. I deserved this. It wasn't that bad. It's my own fault for letting it get to me. I should have done something differently. And this is especially true if we have been subjected to narcissistic abuse, because in the narcissistic dynamic, we're usually taught that we're the ones to blame for the terrible things that happen to us. It's very gaslighty. And I do have an episode on narcissistic abuse if you want information on that. But essentially, I wanted to write this episode to share an epiphany that I had with you guys this week. So I'm sure, as you know, if you've been following the podcast, I consider myself to be a pretty self-aware person. I've done a lot of work to be aware of what's going on in my head and my emotions. I'm not perfect by any means, but I am very aware of when I am acting badly, so to speak, but I am very aware of what's going on with me, even when I struggle with certain aspects of my mental health. And so when I have big epiphanies about something, it's usually really surprising to me. I know it shouldn't be, because we're always growing, we're always evolving into newer, stronger versions of ourselves. Now, to set you up for this epiphany so you can be shocked along with me, I need to tell you a bit of a story about what happened and what led up to it, so bear with me. It all started with jury duty, of all things. I was summoned to jury duty this last week. In jury duty here in America, if you're not familiar with it, if you're somewhere else in the world, we get a summons and then we're on call for that week. So we have to keep calling the jury hotline to see if we have to come in. And so I had been doing that for the first 2 or 3 nights, and then I got the notification that yes, I did need to come to the courthouse for jury duty. So I show up there. It's some ungodly hour, like 8 in the morning, which for me is terrible because I usually can't fall asleep before like 1 or 2 at night. And so I was very sleep deprived, but here I am trying to look respectable, waiting for my turn to be called. And they call my number because they don't refer to you by your name. They just refer to you by your number from this pool of applicants. And so they call my number. And so of all the people that showed up, I did have to go upstairs to the courtroom, and I was sitting in the overflow box at first, because in the jury process in America, they start with 14 people, and then they ask you a bunch of questions, and then someone can dismiss you, either the judge or the prosecutor or the defense, if there is something about your background that would make it difficult for you to be impartial, because you're supposed to be as impartial as possible in a jury trial, right? So they try to look for any biases. And so sat in this room, got called upstairs, a few people got dismissed, ended up in the jury box, and then I go through this whole process of listening to everyone talk, etc., etc. They ask us a lot of questions. And then we find out that the topic of the trial is the sexual assault of a minor by an adult. And so this person is 15 now, I think is what they said, but when it happened to her, she was much younger. And so we're supposed to disclose anything that would be of conflict to that. So of course, I'm honest with them, and I tell them, as you will know if you've listened to Who Killed My Mother or any of the many episodes here in which I talk about the negative effects of sexual assault. I was very honest, and I said, yes, I have personal experience with this in the sense that my mother was sexually assaulted as a child, so you should be aware of that, because again, they're looking for bias. And so they dismissed me. Not surprising. The defense is like, please go home. Because they think I'm going to be biased against his client, obviously, right? But this experience, this sitting in the courtroom, listening to all this stuff about this case, looking at this prosecutor trying to figure out how she's going to package the case, setting us up for it, because it's really interesting if you've ever had this experience to watch these attorneys at work the prosecution and the defense, they're already trying to get you to like them, to clarify what they're going to be doing during the trial. And so it was just a very interesting case study in human behavior and how persuasion works in a courtroom. But anyway, that's not really the topic of this episode. But what it did do was that it planted in me this seed, this curiosity about a case like this, because I could already see how challenging it would be to prove that something had happened if the defendant is really young, if the defendant, like my mother, would have had to explain to a bunch of people what had happened to her. Because in the American court of law, at least how it's supposed to be, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, meaning that we're supposed to assume that the perpetrator, in this case this grown man, is innocent rather than guilty. And the defense attorney, to his credit, he was being very charismatic. He was being very persuasive in us keeping an open mind. And then this led me to come home that night. Of course, I start Googling all about this person. Who was he? Was there anything in the news about it? I didn't find anything, so I can't share any details. I don't think I'm supposed to share any details anyway. I will keep looking for his name, though, going forward, just to see what they end up deciding with the trial, because I am curious to see how it shakes out. But the overall feeling was gratitude that I didn't have to sit through this trial and listen to it, because my God, how hard would it be to sit there and listen to some girl recount things that had happened or that she had believed happened, if we're supposed to keep an open mind about maybe this person wasn't guilty. And it would have just been a way to wreck my entire week, I'm sure. And I would have just been absolutely bereft for this poor child. And so I'm glad I didn't have to sit through that. I hope that whatever happens, justice prevails. But what led me to writing this episode is that when I got home that night, I started looking up what these charges meant, because it was mentioned as second-degree sexual assault. And so I didn't really know what that meant. That doesn't mean anything to me, second-degree sexual assault. What even happened? And so I was trying to figure out what this means, and it reminded me that actually what my father had been convicted of was second-degree sexual assault. And so I started Googling my dad's name, of all things. And I found this random paper clipping from 1988, of all things. It was the week that this article was published, the week that my father was convicted of his crime. And I want to read you this article and then explain to you why this created an entirely different epiphany, an entirely different experience for me. But I need to preface this with the fact that the article itself is written for a newspaper, and so it's more descriptive and sensational than what I usually share on the podcast. So I've been very open and honest and detailed in my depiction of what's happened to my mother, on who killed my mother, and of course we talk about difficult things on this show too, but I don't ever tell you things in this sort of sensationalized way. I tell you things more in the service of getting to the point of something. So if you are someone who was going to be triggered by description of sexual assault, maybe you're going to want to skip ahead a minute or two and not listen to this reading of this clipping. Use your own discretion here. This is my version of a trigger warning. And then I will read you this article so you know what it says. So the headline is Pleads Guilty to Rape. Back in early November 1987, Shrum, 29 years of age, of Raleigh, North Carolina, allegedly came to the door of a North Raleigh woman's home and asked for sugar. Shrum then put a knife to the victim's throat and forced her to the bedroom where he assaulted her, law enforcement officials say. Following the attack, the woman provided police with an excellent composite that led to Shrum's arrest. After distributing the composite to local night spots soon after the attack, about 3 months later, 2 Bennigan's employees recognized the suspect in the Six Forks Road restaurant and called police. At the trial, Shrum pleaded guilty in Wake Superior Court to second-degree rape and second-degree sexual offense in the attack. In return for the plea, Assistant District Attorney Thomas Ford dropped the 2 first-degree rape and sexual offense charges. And so that's the article about my father. And I was so surprised to read this, and I'll tell you why. This is where the epiphany came from. Because, of course, I knew that my father had been convicted of rape. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned that to you guys before. But I did not know that it was of such a violent nature. So the way that he had described his experiences is he painted it in a very different light. The way he explained it to me, and this would have been in my early 20s, obviously I was not a child when he explained to me what happened, because he got home from prison when I was about 8, 9 years old. And so obviously we were not having a conversation about what he was in prison for back then. But when I was in my 20s and I asked him what happened, he painted this story of like a dubious consent situation where, he knew this woman and maybe, they had agreed to have sex, but she changed her mind, or it would have never have gotten that far, gone to trial. The only reason they believed the things that they believed about him was because my mother had testified against him and she had made up all these lies and so on and so forth. So it was a terrible instance in all cases, right? Rape is rape, but it was not described in any capacity. And of course, now that I think about it, why in the world would he tell me that this was the situation? But it was not described in such a violent capacity. And so when I realized that what he was arrested for, what he went to prison for, was essentially even just a plea deal to reduce the more serious charges, which means that he must have believed they had enough to convict him of the first charges, right? That would be my first assumption. And maybe that's not correct. Maybe you guys can tell me many reasons why people would accept a deal, even if it's not accurate information or even if they're absolutely innocent. I'm sure there's my ignorance of the legal system showing here. But when I read this, my first thought was that they must have had a really good case against him. And so he took the plea deal to escape a more severe sentence. And the information that they had, as detailed as this is, it was already terrible, right? So, oh my gosh, it just was very shocking to me. And upon reading this article, recognizing that this was a very different depiction of what I knew, it kind of changed my perspective of him. It changed the way that I viewed him as a person. Because obviously it's a very different person who would take advantage of someone and manipulate this gray area, who clearly is just someone who doesn't really have enough integrity to do the right thing or to be a good person. There's that. And then there's someone who would violently assault a person. Because think about it. I mean, maybe you don't want to think about it too closely. But what I realized when I read this article is that for him to have even committed this crime, he would have had to stalk this woman to a certain extent to figure out where she lived. Because even if he didn't know her, he had to have figured out that there was a woman who lived here in this domicile and that when she would be alone. At the very baseline, he would have had to have figured that out. And you can't do that unless you stalk a person. Because otherwise, what if he just knocked on someone's door and a 8-foot bodybuilder opened, right? So obviously he had to have done, quote, his homework. And that's a very different mentality than this is just something I behaved badly in a situation and so on and so forth, the way that he depicted it. That is much more menacing to me, this idea that you would do your homework so that you could hurt somebody. You can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, those are two entirely different levels of character, I guess, would be, for lack of a better word, someone who would do their homework to hurt somebody and then someone who just acted very poorly and behaved badly and did something terrible sort of on the spur of the moment. And so knowing that he had the capacity to be the kind of person to do his homework and then follow through with something terrible, because not only did he do his homework, he actually had the gall to go up to someone's door. Maybe this is my introvert tendency here. I don't go up to anyone's door for any reason whatsoever, but go up to someone's door, lie to their face, and then proceed to do this terrible, violent thing. That was, for lack of a better word, pretty shocking to me. And it triggered in me this entire review of who I thought my father was. Did I already know he was a terrible, narcissistic person? Absolutely. I have been very open about the abuse I have sustained from this man over the course of my life. Narcissistic abuse, to say the least. But now I had this context of, if this is actually the kind of person he is, and what prison taught him was just to hide that better, right? Just to hide these impulses better. It made me review a lot of the things that we said to each other, like a lot of things that he said to me. For example, he once talked about how he was so angry at my mom and my grandmother and my uncle that he thought about driving up to the house and actually killing them all, but he didn't want to go back to prison. And then he laughed about it like it was a big joke. Well, now I know that he's actually the kind of person who struggles with that sort of impulse control, because he actually went up to someone's house and did something terrible because he felt like it. And so it doesn't feel like a joke anymore, right? Now this feels much more serious. And so thinking about things like that, comments that he made, another one that he had said in the past is, I think I had a health class in school and we were talking about rape prevention or something to that nature. And his response to that, well, the first thing that will happen if a guy decides he wants to rape you is punch you in the face. And that was very surprising to me at the time at 16. But now, again, that statement has such a different color to it now that I've read this article about him than it did when I heard those words from him in the past. It also helped me to understand why in the world he thought he was a good father. Because my brain really struggled to reconcile the idea that my father thought he was a good dad to me and my experiences of being abused by him. Because I was a child and I was on the receiving end of all this narcissistic abuse, my inclination is to think, well, I must be wrong. I must have gotten it wrong. I must have been a bad kid. I must deserve this somehow. That's what we think when we are abused by people. We learn to blame ourselves because they spend all this time abusing us and telling us it's our own fault that these things are happening to us. And we start to believe that with enough time and exposure. And one of the factors keeping that in place, or keeping me from being able to completely shake off this self-doubt that maybe I was bad, maybe I deserved it, was his absolute complete certainty that he was a good dad. His conviction when he would say statements like, you don't know how good it is, you don't know how bad it could be, so on and so forth. And now that I've read this article, I'm like, well, yeah, you would think you were a great father if this was the kind of impulse control you were struggling with. Think about it. If you had it in you to do this kind of terrible thing, if you had these sort of dark impulses in you, and then you raised a child and you didn't, kill the child every time you wanted to, or choke the child, or stab the child, any of these terrible things that you could have done. If you didn't do that, even though maybe you had the dark thoughts and the impulses to do so, you would be like, I'm really great. I did a really good job. I really held myself back. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, okay, I can see now why he thought he was amazing when in fact he was doing the absolute bare minimum of just not killing me or hurting me in an irrevocable way. Though we can absolutely argue that narcissistic abuse does detrimental damage, and I know it has because I've had to pick up the pieces from those experiences all my life. So this epiphany that I had this week, that what kind of person my father really was and what that really meant for a lot of the experiences that we had, helped to distance me even more from the abuse that I experienced, which is great because, like with my mother, when I learned about the things that had happened to her, it was like, oh wow, of course this is why you are the way you are. And I was able to heal from that. I was able to move past it, to forgive her for everything that happened, to really contextualize her in the experiences of her abuse, and it just healed everything, and it took away all that pain, all those hurt feelings that were existing between us. So I'm really looking forward to now being able to do this with my dad, because he's an entirely different person in my mind now than what he was before. In my mind in the past, we just didn't agree that I was a worthy human being. Maybe he was right, maybe my view of myself is flawed, etc. But now it's like, no, actually, and now I can process that and put even more distance between myself and the abuse. And it helped me to just recognize the stories we tell ourselves about our abuse and the way those stories impact our self-view. Now, what do you do? If you're someone who has your own abuse narrative, if you've been through some things, if someone treated you poorly, made you feel bad about yourself, how can you move through it? It's obviously great if something happens, like you find an article and discover that your father actually has psychopathic tendencies and maybe it really wasn't your fault at all. Or if you discover some secrets about your mother's family and the abuse and you're like, oh, okay, it wasn't that she didn't love me enough to take care of me. It was that she was really struggling mentally. She had some serious PTSD, some serious mental health issues that were not treated or supported by anyone in her life. It's great if you can learn about the detonation event of your life, but if you don't have some epiphany like that, what can you do? Like, how can you help yourself move past these negative experiences? And this would be the process that I recommend. I will be using this in conjunction with my information, but it also stands alone even if you don't have something that helps you shift your perspective like that. So the first step is to acknowledge the abuse. So recognizing and accepting that what happened to you was abusive. That's really hard to do. It took me a long time even just to get to that point because, again, if you have a narcissist in your life, they spend a lot of time and energy convincing you that it's all in your head. And so even just getting to a place where you can accept that, no, actually, this is abuse, this is abusive behavior, is really challenging. But if you can get there, if you can acknowledge that, that would be the first step towards understanding and contextualizing what's happened to you. One of the activities I would recommend for that, of getting closer to that acknowledgement, to that acceptance space, would be to write down your experiences and the feelings that you had around those experiences, abusive experiences in particular, and then look at that and just pretend that it's not you who wrote it. So imagine that your best friend or someone you really loved told you that this happened to them, told you that this is how it made them feel. And just be like, absolutely, those feelings are valid. Absolutely, that is an appropriate way to respond to a terrible situation like that. And then just try to gradually turn that same affection and support and acknowledgement toward yourself. It always helps me to sometimes start as if I'm talking to a best friend rather than myself, and then slowly be like, but we can love ourselves too, right? We can be nice to ourselves too, until I'm like, oh, okay. And so the resistance to it gets weaker and weaker until I'm able to fully apply that validation and acknowledgement to my own experiences. Another thing that we can do is to look for the patterns and the behavior of the abuse. And so again, we often blame ourselves for things that happen, but there's a saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. But if you repeatedly see something over and over again, it's pretty clear that it's probably a them problem, not a you problem. So in the case of my father, for example, he went to prison for rape. He also was investigated for possible molestation after he got out of prison. He had all these failed marriages. He had accounts of my mother and other women talking about his tendency to be violent domestically. That's a lot of smoke. It should at some point, if I keep pointing out these patterns to myself, be really clear that actually, no, this is the kind of person he is. Like, how many instances or examples do you have to have before you begin to believe? And same with my uncle, who had those 117 criminal charges on his record by the time that he had killed my mother. That's a lot of criminality to not recognize that this man had a psychopathic trait, antisocial personality disorder, something, right? Something was going on here. That is a lot to be on one person's record, to not realize that there's a pattern to who he was as a person. And so looking at these physical, emotional, psychological abuse situations and see if it's connected to a pattern and being like, oh, actually, this is who they are because they're doing this over and over again. Recognizing this pattern can be done either by looking at everything that happened. Maybe you could create a timeline. Maybe you can make a list of things that feel like they are repetitious in this person's behavior or in their actions. Note anything that keeps happening again and again and again. So in my father's case, things that are like misogynistic, crimes against women, rape charges, investigations. If I listed all that down on a piece of paper and I looked at it, I'd be like, wow, there is obviously a pattern here. Like, that is not me making him do any of these things. Obviously, I was a child. And so it may make it easier for you to see the patterns of this person's behavior if you can group all of those incidents and experiences together in one place. It also helps to look at the dynamics of a relationship. So there are certain relationship dynamics when it comes to abuse. Usually there's a power imbalance of some way. Somebody has more power than the other. In my case, my father has more power than I did as the child. That is a social power construct, right? So society gives him more power as the father than me as the child. Children are supposed to obey. Children are supposed to be obedient. And that power imbalance can set us up for abuse. So if there's someone who has more power over you, a boss or a parent or some kind of family member, it puts you at a risk to be more vulnerable. If you also can see manipulation tactics, so my father had many manipulation tactics that he used to try to control me. And when you can see these manipulation tactics, you can see how it influences the dynamic in general. One of the things that my therapist had recommended to me many years ago, I don't remember how many years I was into therapy at the point that he recommended this. It maybe was a year in, but there was this idea of writing a role play to help me to see how essentially crazy his behavior was, for lack of a better word, how manipulative, how narcissistic. Because I kept saying like, oh, well, but he's just my dad and he wants what's best for me, etc. And my therapist wasn't having it. He was like, let's do a game. Essentially. And what it was is that I wrote out a scene in which I had the two characters. It was my father and me, and I, made him say all the things he would say, and I made me say all the things that I would say in these situations. And then we changed it. So the part that my therapist made me do, and he was like, okay, now imagine they're two best friends. Okay, imagine that it's a husband and a wife. Okay, imagine that it's two sisters. Imagine that it's etc. Until I started to see why he looked not so great, like why his character looked more suspicious, I guess we could say. Because in these different roles, I'm like, oh yeah, if they were best friends, he should never talk to his best friend that way. Or, oh yeah, if that is your partner, like, that's terrible. Why would you say these things to them? And he was like, yeah, it's terrible. Why would they say these things to him? It was kind of one of those situations. So helping me to see and understand the power imbalance, helping me to see and understand the manipulation tactics that he was using. So you can try a role role play like that if you wanted to try to get a better glimpse. Because sometimes we're just so close to a situation, it's really hard to see it. And if we can find a way to take a step back, it just really clarifies things for us. You can also start to reflect on the impact that this abuse has had on your life. So how has it affected you emotionally, mentally, physically? Again, for a long time, I pretended like everything that happened was my own fault and that it wasn't that big of a deal, partially because he kept telling me, you don't know how good you have it. You don't know how good I am to you. And I absolutely believed him and thought that proof that he had been so good to me was that he had given me a car in high school and he had given me a credit card for emergencies and he had sent me on a trip when I graduated high school. So clearly he was good to me, right? It didn't register to me at the time that this is a pattern of narcissists, this love bombing, this giving you things so that they can hold it over your head later and use it as proof of why you don't appreciate them, why you're not grateful when they then do abusive things to you. All of that was beyond my comprehension. And so in order to recognize that things were not okay, I had to start to really accept that he had affected me emotionally, mentally, physically. Like this abuse really had hurt me. And it had created lifelong impacts on the way I move through the world, how I feel in my own skin, how comfortable I am even existing in a space, which, thanks to his abuse, was very little. I did not feel like I deserved to be on this planet because of the way he spoke to me and the things that he did to me. And it was really important for me to acknowledge that in order to process it. Mindfulness was really helpful for that, practicing mindfulness, becoming aware of where I was feeling the abuse in my body or in my emotions, really tapping into those sensations, to those emotional responses. That was really effective for me. Giving myself credit that I actually am a strong, resilient person to have been able to survive this abuse. Affirmations can be used for that, creating, repeating affirmations that acknowledge your resilience, your strength. I'm a really strong person. I'm a really resilient person. I can heal anything. Tell yourself what you need to hear, what your abuser probably didn't tell you, right? Which is how incredible you are, how strong you are, what a survivor you are. And be that voice of reason for yourself. Recognize your strength and your abilities and continue to work to place those experiences in the context of your life. Because it would be silly to pretend that it did not affect us, right? It would be silly to pretend that we weren't influenced by these terrible abusive things that happened, that our decisions weren't influenced, that our relationships weren't influenced, that our ability to grow and to change and to be brave or to go after the things we want, that wasn't influenced. And no pressure. But if you can find meaning in the things that happen to you and using that to help other people, that does feel better. I can tell you, as someone who has been working now for a couple years, trying to advocate for wellness, well-being, trying to help others to connect with their strength, with their resiliency, that it does make it easier. It does make it feel like the things I went through weren't wasted. They became a platform for me to use to help other people. So if you can do that as well, that would be amazing. I think personally, I am speaking from a place of bias, of course, but if you can find meaning in the things that happen to you, that does help. And then just do whatever you can to integrate that experience into your narrative in a different way. So as I mentioned, when I read this article and it shifted how I viewed my father, it helped me to create more and more distance between these lingering doubts I had about my inherent goodness as a human being, lingering doubts I had about whether or not maybe I deserved some of the things that happened. Keep building that distance if you can. Anything you can do to make you start to see that was not okay. I don't deserve that. Maybe I was manipulated. Maybe I didn't see the situation right. I'm always a big fan, because I love creativity as a tool for healing. I'm always a big fan of using art or music or writing to process your abuse, to contextualize your abuse. I did an entire podcast, Who Killed My Mother, for that exact purpose, to process and understand what had happened when my mother was killed. And so use your journal, use your computer, use whatever you need to use to write out the things that have happened to you, to find the meaning in it, to process what has happened, and take control of your story. You are the one writing your own story, and you have the power to integrate those experiences in your mind however you can, using any means that you can to help set yourself free. It's just important to know that you give your life meaning. You give the experiences that you have endured their significance. I was doing that even before I learned about my father's charges, when I told myself that maybe I deserve the things that happened to me, maybe he wasn't such a bad dad, maybe I'm just actually an ungrateful person. That's what I was doing. I was making up stories about myself and the abuse that I endured. But this is your invitation to write a new story, one that does not paint yourself as the villain or as a victim. You can paint yourself in a much kinder and gentler and more powerful or creative light, and I absolutely encourage you to do that. And that's it for today, dear human. As always, if you found this episode useful and you would like to write into the show today and ask me for my thoughts on something that you're dealing with, I would love to hear from you through any of my social media or through email at Kory@KoryMschrum.com. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human, and until then, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Kory Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Kory Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.